Hello and welcome to this episode of Quakerism. In this episode, I want to talk about an accusation that Quakers throw about, mainly to each other and possibly also to themselves. And the accusation goes like this: what would early Quakers think of us now? Or what would George Fox think of us now? And I want to talk about maybe a response to that sort of thought or accusation, why we might have that accusation, and where we can go from there. I suppose first and foremost, I, like any other Quaker, am greatly thankful to the early friends and get a lot from their works, their journals, and obviously very just thankful that they started a movement which has meant so much to me all those years ago. I've just finished reading Early Quakers and Their Theological Thought. I read that, I think I finished it just before Christmas time, and it's really good. It goes through the first generation Quakers and the second generation Quakers and looks at their theological thought, their things that perhaps their peculiarities, the things that in their theology that maybe made them different to the mainstream, and really tries to expound why they think that, how they came to that decision, and also how their theological thought progressed as well through their lives and through their journey, their spiritual journeys in Quakerism. It's a fantastic book. It's quite academic. It's quite dense. It took me a long time to read it, but it is worth it if that is something that you can do. I would recommend that book. So a lot of respect for the early friends, and I think that's important to say right off. What I think we have to be careful of, though, and I think this book did sort of exemplify that to me, is that there's a tendency in Quakerism to, for simplicity and ease, to say that George Fox founded Quakerism, which is not true. He was a great inspirational leader of Quakerism, and he was certainly an organizational force in terms of getting the Quaker movement working logistically. So yes, he was a great important leader of Quakerism, and I think in my introduction to Quaker I think I did say that George Fox was the founder of Quakerism. However, the early Quakers were there were a lot of them, and that all of them sort of did come together to create, and were all equally responsible to create the society that came out of the 17th century. There was the Valiant 60, these 60 people that went out and spread the Quaker faith throughout the British Isles and beyond. There was the work of many others, as well as George Fox, in terms of the organizational aspect of it as well. I was thinking of Richard Farnworth, for example, and George Whitehead, both phenomenally important early Quakers in terms of the organizational and setting up of Quakerism as well. That to put it all on George Fox would be a disservice to all the other wonderful early Quakers that we have as well. I suppose people throw this sort of accusation that, well, what would early Quakers think of us now, when the society goes through a period of change, maybe, or when something new happens? And it is, I suppose, a bit of a reactionary accusation, sort of saying, well, are we sure we want to make this change? Are we not going too far from our roots or our heritage in making this change? I think also perhaps there are a lot of people who maybe read the early friends and kind of wish that it was still like that now. And I think, if you when you read these people who are so full with the spirit and so excited by this new tradition that they founded, and they're in meeting for like every day for hours. I mean, sounds lovely. So there are many reasons why I can see why that would be the case. I think, though, we have to be a bit careful with this, because what do we mean by that? I understand maybe the desire maybe to return back to maybe a golden age of Quakerism, and with dwindling numbers and the rise of secularism and atheism and all that sort of stuff, then that could encourage some friends to think, well, gosh, wasn't it great back then? I'm going to do a video, actually. I read another book called Primitive Quakerism Revived. Primitive Quakerism Revived, here it is, by Paul Buckley, which is sort of like this. And now he's very clear that he doesn't want it to be reactionary, and he doesn't want it to be, oh, let's just go back to some time which was better. But his time is to basically recapture vitality, I suppose, of early Quakerism and put it into a modern setting. But I think we all have to be aware that we can't take an aspect of the past and put it into into the present out of context. Nor realistically, even if all we know about early Quakerism or the past generally, we're putting our modern mindsets on that and a certain sense of nostalgia as well. And so, even with the most informed background about our past in terms of Quakerism or just generally, we're always going to have a certain feeling of nostalgia because we know precisely how it happened. We know what happened at what dates, and we can look at the past from sort of afar, knowing what's going to happen. Whereas the present feels scary. We don't know what's going to happen. We don't, is Quakerism going to survive? And all of this, and if we change so much, will we just become too disparate from each other and from what Quakerism is actually meant to be doing? And so it can lead to quite a lot of stress, which the past doesn't have. But like I said, we can't take the past out of context into a segment of the past out of the past and into the future. Um, we would have to take it wholesale with everything else that comes back to it. And I don't think there's really anyone, I really, in the modern period who'd say, I would really love to live in exactly the same conditions as existed in the 17th century. That would be mad. Early Quakerism came out of this time. It came out of the 17th century with all of the terrible prison conditions and no rights and civil war. It's not necessarily an environment which I would personally want to live in. I'm grateful that Quakerism obviously came out of that time, but we can't ever go back, and we can't even ask what would these early friends think of Quakerism now, because they would be coming completely out of their context. I mean, if we invited George Fox into 2023, I mean, he wouldn't even know where to begin, would he? Even if you brought him to a Quaker meeting, no, he probably wouldn't recognize anything, but he'd also be baffled by phones and what language are speaking. I get what people are saying. I think they're trying to get this idea that, are we moving too far from our origins? Are we moving away from the initial intention of early friends like George Fox? And the answer will be yes, because humanity does that. I mean, realistically, I don't think that's different in many other traditions either. I mean, Catholics, regardless of what they say, if you go to a Catholic mass, a normal Novus Ordo mass today in England, that would look very different to maybe one even 200 years ago. Certainly different from like 700 years ago. So there's every faith does go on a journey. You may argue that the Quakers' journey has gone, you could argue, gone further away from its original source than others, perhaps, in a shorter period of time. But then with a tradition which believes in continuing revelation, that makes sense. We're not beholden to a creed. We're not beholden to scripture telling us that no, this is how it has to be, and a certain uh, and a certain layout of a meeting for worship. We don't have any of that. So it's natural that we progress and change. We've had very distinct periods of Quakerism, from its evangelical beginnings to Quietism to evangelicalism Mark II, as in biblical literalism, and then liberalism. So we've gone on a journey, but I think that's not really out of sync with other denominations, uh, and I think that it makes sense because of our belief in continuing revelation. I think also I find it quite interesting that there are different types of Quakerism. I'm talking from a British liberal Quaker perspective, but I mean especially if you look to America or to Africa or South America, there are different types of Quakerism. So each branch of Quakerism each feels that they are upholding true Quakerism, or Quakerism, as it was initially intended by the early friends, and in reality, none of us are. And I think everyone does acknowledge that, but I think they all believe that they are holding more to um, the beliefs of early friends than the other branches. Probably what's more true is that we just hold dear to different elements of that. So in reality, we've all changed. I don't think an early Quaker could go into any modern meeting for worship and feel that yes, well, this is precisely how it was in the 1600s. So it's really quite impossible to really reinstate Quakerism as it was in the 17th century, or the Quakerism that George Fox would have known, because it's not the 17th century anymore. And we have continued to listen to the light and to guidance and stuff, and through that we have changed. And so we have got to say, well, we live in a very different society now. We've developed our tradition to where they are now. It would be strange to then judge it by a person from right back at its beginning, because it has moved on. And I suppose people might argue, well, is that a good thing or a bad thing? But that's just the way that that progress happens. We as beings are constantly moving forward, and so we can look back and see, well, have we moved too far? Have we strayed? But just because of the nature of Quakerism, I think that can't be a bad thing. I suppose also, you know, in the same way, it's impossible really for us to imagine George Fox criticizing modern Quakerism. It's equally impossible for us to really make a judgment on um, early Quakerism as well, because we weren't there. We're not 17th century beings. So we can try and understand everything as best as we can, understand the concepts, understand the societal changes and all of that sort of stuff. But we're not. And so we would be judging early Quakerism with our 21st century mindset, whether we want to or not. Similarly, George Fox would be judging us with his 17th century mindset. He wouldn't be able to understand why we do things in a certain way we do, because he hasn't experienced the 21st century. I find it a bit of a strange argument. Ultimately, I think I understand the concept of wanting to make sure that we don't go too far from our roots. I think that does have a certain quietist element to it, of not wanting to overtake the light or overtake one's guide. um, I think that's I think we've got to be a bit careful with that, because if we're going to be open to new light, if we're going to be open to continued revelation and believe that the divine is truly speaking to us and leading us and guiding us, then he's not going to keep us in the same place that we were in the 17th century. We're moving. And so I think we have to be okay with that. I think it's right to consider whether or not any changes that we're making are for the best for the society, but to consider that we should stay precisely the same since the 17th century is, I think, moot. So, what would George Fox say if he came into my meeting? Well, I think he'd be thoroughly flummoxed about a lot of things. But I would like to think that if I got a chance to really, if I, to go to meeting with George Fox, that I would take a lot from him. I'd like to think that he'd take a lot from us moderns, and um, maybe that would be really useful. But I think judgment there, like with everything, I think we're all trying to listen to the same spirit, all trying to listen to the same source. So we can't really criticize or judge each other. We're all trying to do the same thing. So I'm quite happy for people to disagree with me on this. I sometimes feel, I personally, for example, feel this quite a lot with early liberal Quakerism. I'm a big fan of the early liberal Quakers. Not necessarily Rufus Jones, but my probably my biggest Quaker hero is John William Rowntree. And uh, and so I quite often think, oh well, I wish Quakerism were like that a bit more than it is currently. And so for exactly the same reasons, I can't really make that call. But I don't know. Is there an element of Quakerism that you think that you particularly hold dear? And if so, what elements of that do you think we're lacking now? And would it be possible to bring them back in? And how would that be done? Let me know. We'll talk about it. And let's see if by doing things like that, we can talk about maybe bettering the society today instead of judging it by previous standards. Thank you very much for watching the video. If you liked it, please do click on the thumbs up and the subscribe button to get more videos about Quakerism in the UK today. It really does help, and thanks once again.